Today I'll be making a book review of Franz Kafka's Letter to Father. This is not a novel, it is an actual real letter that Franz Kafka wrote to his father, with whom he had a really troubled relationship with. And so his intention was, with the letter, was to sort of confess and to explain to him how he experienced his childhood and how he experienced his father and how it shaped him as a person. Backstory to the letter: he wrote this letter with intention of giving to his father, but he showed it first to his mother, and she actually advised him not to give it to him, which he never did then. So his father never saw this letter, which is tragic, of course. Franz Kafka and his father were two very different people. I think this is best illustrated by looking at pictures of them, of Kafka and his father. His father was a very big and strong man, very masculine. He was a businessman, whilst Kafka, on the other hand, was sort of his polar opposite. If you look at picture Kafka, he's quite small, skinny, timid, and to his character quite indecisive and anxious and insecure, and also a writer, so which is kind of like the opposite of a businessman. So there's this clear, or at least Kafka feels that he is almost the opposite to his father, and he says this he relates an episode from his childhood when him and his father are at the beach, and they are in the water with a shirtless, and he says, "There was I, skinny, weakly, slight, you strong, tall, and broad." So the clear oppositions between the two. Sort of this opposition to him and his father, which I think is a big reason for their alienation and estrangement. He derives from the fact that Kafka sees himself more as the son of his mother, Löwy. Her last name was Löwy, whilst his father's name was Kafka. So he says this in a quote: "Compare the two of us, I, to put it in a very much abbreviated form, a Löwy with a certain Kafka component, which, however, is not set in motion by the Kafka will to life, business, and conquest, but by a Löwish spur that impels more secretly, more diffidently, and in another direction, which often fails to work entirely. You, on the other hand, a true Kafkan strength, health, appetite, loudness of voice, eloquence, self-satisfaction, worldly dominance, and endurance." He goes on, but I will stop the quote there. So another theme in this letter, a big theme, is feelings of shame and guilt, which Kafka felt in relation to his father. So his father had this very hard childhood. He basically had to leave the house at 14 to go out and work, just live by himself. And from this he sort of built himself up and acquired his business. And this, of course, says a lot about his father's character, being this strong-willed person who came from nothing but built himself up. Whilst Kafka, on the other hand, he sort of lived off the fruits of this hard work of his father, because he, on the other hand, was brought up in privilege. They had everything, and this very privilege was the source of his shame and guilt, because he had everything and he should be grateful to his father, but he doesn't feel this because they have a troubled relationship. But then his father had nothing, and he gave Kafka everything economically, so he should be grateful, but he doesn't feel he is grateful, and thereby this feeling of guilt arises within Kafka, that he should be grateful but he's not. And he also feels this because Kafka was the oldest son, so he was sort of expected to work and take over the shop, which he didn't want to do. So he felt he says this, he feels like a bad son and an inadequate son. He also says in a quote, "Everything you gave me made me feel guilty." He used this story, or this narrative of him coming from nothing and working hard, whilst his son Kafka having everything, living in privilege. He uses as a sort of emotional blackmail. He writes this in a quote: "From the many occasions on which I had, according to your clearly expressed opinion, deserved a beating, but was let off at the last moment by your grace. I again accumulated only a huge sense of guilt. On every side I was to blame. I was in your debt. And sort of what this quote means is it's sort of twisted, because of course it is bad and you should never beat your children, but his father says you deserve a beating, but I won't, because I am so gracious and good. And then Kafka has to, and from that he feels he's in debt to his father, which is very strange, because not beating someone doesn't mean that they're doing something good to you. And this sort of feeling of this eternal shame, always feeling shame and guilt, I think this is in relation to his father as a source of the feelings of guilt and shame in his book The Trial, because basically in this book the protagonist is being accused of a crime, but he doesn't know what it is. And sort of the logical thing would be just to, well, if they can't state what the crime is, then you can just ignore it. You don't have to listen to him and comply. But he sort of, from his own free will, he seeks out the court and the judges and engages with them, almost as if he had this feeling of guilt and shame inside him, and he was almost convinced himself that he was guilty of something, but he didn't know what. And another traumatizing thing from Kafka's relationship to his father was that his father was quite unfair. The authoritative man, he writes, Kafka, the authoritative man did not keep the commandments you imposed on me. And he also writes that his father was very critical of the people who worked in his business. He had a shop, Kafka's father, and he used to make these quite terrible jokes about them and criticize them, but he himself, the father, was above all criticism. And I think these hypocrisy and double standards, and his father not being consequential with his sort of criticisms and judgments was very they affected Kafka a lot. So Kafka writes that the reason why his father particularly had such a big impact on him was because he felt that his father was the whole world. He writes specifically, for you were for me the measure of all things. Everything in the world he sees in relationship to his father, including himself. He gets his self-identity as, for example, in the beginning with the quote of him being a lovey. So he, a lovey, the opposite of Kafka, his father. So even his sense of self is determined in relationship to his father. And yeah, and this quote is really, really interesting. I think probably one of the most interesting quotes in the letter, especially in relationship to understanding Kafka's fiction. He says, "My writing was all about you. All I did there, after all, was to bemoan what I could not bemoan upon your breast." This, of course, is very interesting, because this makes it explicit that we can analyze Kafka's work in relation to his relationship to his father. So if we look at his work, like the Metamorphosis, the character wakes up one day as a bug, as an insect, and of course Kafka probably felt this useless son in relationship to this strong father. He must have felt insignificant and weak like a bug. And of course the trial, where there's this big overwhelming bureaucratic power which sort of engulfs the main character. This must sort of being a symbolic representation of the overwhelming power he felt from his father, which sort of consumed him and oppressed him. And another interesting quote, which is very literary and metaphorical, is sometimes I imagine the map of the world spread out and you stretch diagonally across it, and I feel as if I could consider living in only those regions that are not covered by you or are not within your reach. This is, well, explicit how he feels that his father covers the whole world. There's no place in the world, or few places in the world, where he can go without the presence of his father. One of my favorite parts with this letter is, and sort of what elevates, I think, Kafka above the the average person, is despite his father being this tyrannical figure, Kafka doesn't see himself entirely as a victim. He says like this: I too believe you are entirely blameless in the matter of our estrangement, but I am equally entirely blameless. So he doesn't say that, oh, it's your fault, you're this type of person, you're tyrannical, and that's why I am who I am. He says that this clash between son and father was not one or the other's fault, it was the combination of the two, of the Kafka and the Lavie, of the strong businessman and the sort of the timid writer. It was the clash between the two that created this friction. It was not entirely the father's fault. And he says this is pretty interesting. I should have been happy to have you as a friend, as a boss, an uncle, a grandfather, even, though rather more hesitantly, as a father-in-law. Only as a father you have been too strong for me. So it's the fact that this man was his father's. He was so close to him that it became too much and overwhelming. But if he would have been at a distance, maybe as a boss, he would have liked it and it would have been good for his development, but he was too close. Hello, so I took a break for a couple of days, but now I'm back, so I'll continue the review. Some of the most heartbreaking moments of this letter, I think, was when Kafka has these small compliments to his father. For example, he says very shortly that you have a very beautiful smile, he says in this letter to his father. I thought that was very, very touching. You know, after all, he describes how difficult he felt that his father was. He's still able to compliment his father, and just the particular use of words, a beautiful smile. It's very unusual for example, for men to compliment each other, saying they're beautiful. Even more so unusual with a son to a father. So yeah, I don't think any other word in this sentence would have made it more heart-touching. Just beautiful that he specifically used that word was very, very strong. And another moment which I liked was, he says, Kafka writes, during my last illness you came tiptoeing to Otla's room to see me. Otla is Kafka's sister. Stopping in the doorway, craning your neck to see me, and out of consideration only waved to me with your hand. At such times one would lie back and weep for happiness, as I weep again now, writing it down. So just this small thing as him standing in the doorway, waving to him, really touched Kafka's heart. I mean, these small things like a beautiful smile or just a wave, which can mean the whole entire world for Kafka. So this letter, even though it was a real letter written to his father and not to be meant to be seen by anyone else, it almost reads as literature. Kafka has a quote which I think is very interesting. He says, not in this letter but elsewhere, I'm not sure where, probably in a diary entry or I don't know. He says, I am nothing but literature and can and want to be nothing else. So Kafka, literature is his whole life. He is unable to think or express himself in any other way than a literary way. And that's what I think is shown in this letter, that it's a letter with no literary purpose, but he writes it as in this very literary way, and I think that's why it's so interesting to read as well, because it's a good read. So in conclusion, I think this letter is obviously, if you want to get to know Kafka as a person, this is probably one of the best things to read. And also it's a very interesting letter to read to understand his work, his body of literature, his work, because as it says, his what was the quote? It was something that all of Kafka's writing was about what he was not able to bemoan on his father's chest. So I think it's probably one of the main keys to understanding Kafka's literature, his relation to his father. Yeah.